everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming through a feminist lens. Today we are the three of us, Matt, Alex and Jem, and we're going to be talking about something which is really quite a taboo topic because I'll talk about how I was raised to view this and how the message and conditioning that society is spread in general is women's anger. The anger that women feel in general and anger that they feel in reaction to how the world treats them. Anger is romanticized for men. And it's saying, oh, he's passionate, he's lively, he's intense. But women, she's hysterical, she's on her period, she's just being stroppy. And I think it's really important for us to talk about it, to give it the validity that it is completely, in my experience of what I've been shown my entire life, that there has never been a valid reason for a woman to be angry. So first question is, how were the two of you raised to view your own anger and the anger of women in general?
It's definitely got me thinking about like a lot of things, which probably would be quite at home in a therapy session, I expect. Yeah, I guess it's how do I start this? My mum, we were often exposed to anger, I guess, through childhood, through my mum just being generally angry at, not like in a bad way necessarily, but like when she was angry, we knew it, and she expressed that in particular ways. And a lot of the times, I came to view my mum as someone that you just don't mess with, and she doesn't take crap. And that's quite a strong character trait, I think, and it's one that you can look up to in a lot of ways. And I guess that's kind of where a lot of the views of my own mum kind of originated, I think, like in the early parts of my childhood, is that she could stick up for herself and she can also stick up for you, kind of thing, through her sort of like her, when she's angry, and when she's angry, you're not going to carry on doing what you're doing, kind of thing. And I think in terms of how I was taught to like express my anger, there were certainly limits to like the levels at which I could be angry, quote unquote. Obviously, there was the whole thing around swearing and not swearing until we were old enough to swear, and yeah, just generally not getting ourselves too het up. I was a very, I think what the trouble was in my childhood, I kept a lot of my emotions kind of inside, and then they all came out in a massive burst. So I was very emotional, particularly in primary school, where I'd go through like really long periods of like hysteric crying because I just didn't really know how to express my feelings, and it all came out as like constant sobbing, particularly in school, which was quite, I think a lot of people regarded me as probably quite annoying because I couldn't control myself and my emotions. And my teachers, one in particular, didn't take very kindly to it, and I was often sort of either taken out of class or just shouted at until I was made to calm down, basically. So there's a lot of like, probably a lot of stuff that I haven't processed from childhood that I probably should. But yeah, I didn't handle emotions particularly well as a child. I don't think they all sort of came out in massive bursts, and I didn't really understand. Like, I couldn't. I think my dad often said I wore my heart on my sleeve, and that not to take things so personally, because I obviously took a lot of things to heart very easily. And now I've kind of learned that obviously it's fine, and I'm much better at dealing with those big rushes of emotion. Um, I think more of the time it was to express upset rather than anger, but I did express anger quite often. I remember my mum telling me once a story where she stuck up for someone who was being bullied and ripped the buttons off the boy's shirt. That was the And I knew that was kind of like, I kind of viewed that as something to look up to in a way, in that she was kind of righting a wrong. And obviously it was a very violent thing to do for a child, to like rip the buttons off someone else's shirt and things. But I think that also comes from the environment that my mum was brought up in, and that was, she had a brother, an older brother, and very often she would, give as good as she got, kind of thing. And there was one childhood story I remember she told us, when my uncle had annoyed her so much that she um, had grabbed a broom and started to hit him with it. And then he ran into the toilet and locked himself in there and was like giggling and stuff like, "Oh, you can't get me now." And then mum rammed the door with the broom and made a hole in the door, and for which she was soundly told off by my grandparents. Oh, I think my camera's gone funny. Hold on. Are we back? Am I back? Good. Um, and yeah, so my mum was, I think it was the only time she was ever um, smacked by my granddad because she had made a hole in the bathroom door. And I've only been smacked by my mum once, and that was when I hit my sister over the head with a large, those wooden horse things that you ride on. Because I was so angry at her for something. I never did it again, and I knew never to do anything like that again after that point because of what had happened. But yeah, that's really, really long-winded and tangential delving into my childhood emotions. So I don't know if that's relevant to your question, Matt, but I think there's a lot of things that kind of get mixed in with it, and a lot of it's to do with like the environment you're in as a child and how your family were brought up and how they express themselves as well. I don't know if Jem feels the same way.
Well, firstly, I have to say that that's all really interesting to
Yeah.
hear, because you're the most serene and
Oh no, I can be
chilled
very angry.
person that
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
met. So I find it interesting that you've got this like fiery side. Yeah, fiery side. That's how I always sort of describe myself. I'm an Aries, and although I don't believe in star signs at all, I did identify very heavily with the fire
Mm.
aspect of that star sign, and I always felt that I'm very quick to anger and very quick to calm down. So I don't tend to hold grudges, which can be frustrating for some people. Not that I don't hold grudges, but that I calm down so quickly because um, I've calmed down while they're still processing the fact that they're a bit annoyed with me. So and I'm like, oh no, I moved on now. I'm onto a different topic. So I think I have quite an interesting relationship with anger, because I never saw it as something that I shouldn't have. I always actually just saw it as sort of quite a positive thing. Um, I I'm I'm quite conflict averse. I don't like to
Right.
fight,
Yeah.
which is a weird combination, because I just get angry and frustrated at things really quickly, but I don't really like to fight, and I think that's partly what will calm me down as soon as I kind of get into that thing where I'm like, oh, actually somebody might be like get really annoyed with me, then I kind of will back off more. Um, but I do think that anger is a much more positive emotion than we generally associated. I mean, I think in general we associate positive and negative with all sorts of emotions, and I think that the reality is that they just exist, and they're valid and important, and they have meaning and relevance in our lives, and it's just about negotiating them. So I don't think that this idea of anger as a negative emotion is very helpful, because I think sometimes anger is what you need to get you through a situation, and to carry you through, to give you the momentum to fight back, whether that be actually physically, or whether it's just emotionally. And I think there's been certain things in my life, and certainly as a parent, where I've needed the anger to drive me through to fight for what my child needs, or for what I need. And I think there's been times where I've been like, I need to hold on to this anger because I need the momentum that it gives me, and I can feel it dissipating away, and I'm like, oh no, I need to hold it. So I think it's a really interesting thing, because everyone you speak to has a different story and a different relationship with anger. And I think there are people that I've met who feel like they shouldn't be angry, that anger is this horribly negative emotion, and especially if they've come from families where a parent didn't show anger, or showed anger but it was scary, like that. I think there's and my mum would get angry and shout and get cross, and I would hear her and my dad arguing, and I think, but what I learned was that it was never, that was never scary. It wasn't. I was never scared. And I was never. Yeah, it was never scary anger. And I think that's why I have quite a positive relationship with anger as an emotion.
Yeah, out of interest, I'm a Sagittarius, so also a fire sign, technically.
Maybe there is something to it
Maybe
all.
there is. Yeah, but no, I think the only other times I think I do get angry only in certain situations, like when I'm driving my car. I've got less angry when driving my car than when I first started. When I'm gaming, and then just also when I'm watching tennis, I can get very, very loud, which you wouldn't expect from me because I'm so softly spoken. But I can be very loud when my passions are running high. Yeah, yeah, definitely. But again, I would agree. I don't think anger is a bad thing necessarily. I think it's bad when you can't express it in a helpful way. I think it does need to be let out, because otherwise it does bad things. So yeah.
We'll get on to a bit about, so the second half of this is going to be about violent women, and thinking of violence as generally, violence is the next step in escalation of anger, right? So because like 90% of all violent crime is committed by men, the leap from anger to violence is, I imagine, a completely different thing. So the reason I wanted to talk to you both about this is because it's just a completely different experience that I've never heard talked about before. I've only ever heard women's rage as a sort of a conceptual thing, as opposed to just the actual everyone feels the same like spectrum of emotions, but for for the purposes of the patriarchy to completely discount the emotions of half of the people on the planet, that isn't nothing. That has to be talked about more. Bringing it to games, what makes you angry? in video games. It doesn't have to be the games themselves, just what makes you just go, ugh.
For me, I think it's actually misogyny and sexism makes me angry in games. I mean, beyond, like, that it makes me angry when a game is frustrating and I can't do it. That makes me really angry. And because I, as I'm always banging on about, have so little gaming time, although I have more at the moment. I get really frustrated when the game is frustrating me. And yeah, so if it's frustration, which will eventually lead to anger, especially if it's just a stupid concept. If it's just something that I need to get good at, then that's fair enough. But if it's just something really silly, then that really frustrates me. But to be fair, like, I genuinely find misogyny and sexism really, really frustrating and anger inducing in games. And I know it was one of my biggest issues with whichever Final Fantasy it was it 13 or 11? I don't know, but anyway, the one where it was like these 4 lads on a road trip.
Oh yeah.
And there was so much. I mean, we've talked about it a number of times before, and it was so much sexism in there, and it just really annoys me because it just grates, and it just, even if the game is okay, it's just that kind of constant. And we get enough of it in our day-to-day lives, and I get enough of it in my activism, such that it is at the moment, and you just think, yeah, I don't need it in my gaming experience. So it does. I think that's the thing in that really bugs me in gaming, is when things are unnecessarily prejudiced and when they are unnecessarily difficult. Like, what about you,
Yeah, I
Alex?
think I definitely get very, very frustrated when the game isn't working how it's supposed to work. Like you're pressing all the right buttons and it's just not doing what you want it to, or like you think you're doing it right and it will go the wrong way. Like in platforming, platforming is intensely frustrating for me, particularly when like I know that there could probably be adaptations made to the controls to make it easier for me, but actually no, I have to do it like this way because that's how the game is programmed and there's no other accessibility options. I find that quite frustrating. Another thing, I think since joining the pod, how many years has it been now? Over 2 years. I've noticed I get more frustrated with like the obvious objectification of female characters in games, and I see it so much more now, like in every trailer. I'm like, oh, there's a shot of bum, oh, there's a shot of boobs and no face. Great. It's just very frustrating to see that because it, like you say, it grates and it does mar the experience of the game that you're playing. But yeah, I can get very angry. Like I will literally just chuck the controller at Tom or whoever else is in the room when I'm just like, no, I can't do it anymore, or I will throw the controller. And that's when I guess the overlap with slightly violent behaviour comes in, where I'll just want to punch something, and I'll go find a cushion, or like I used to throw my tissue box around quite a lot when I was younger. One of these would just like chuck it across the room. And then my mum would yell, "Turn it off, it's just a game," from like the other room. Or she'd come in when she'd hear me shouting and be like, "Turn it off now." And she'd know exactly what my triggers were. And when I needed to stop as well, because that's not always easy either. Yeah, I think those things are very frustrating and anger inducing. Another thing that really annoys me, and I wouldn't say it makes me angry, just irritates me, is just the size of text in games for reading like the lore or whatever else, or collectibles. I cannot read it even with like my glasses on sometimes. I'm just like, why would you not make it larger or have someone read it out? or something, just so I don't have to like squint all the time.
Yeah.
It's very annoying. And also maps, inaccessible maps are really annoying in games. A most recent example of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, they say they improved the map, but they haven't improved the map. There's like 2 levels of zoom, and you're trying to work out which way to go, and you're like back and forth, and you're just like, nope, still no clearer to me whatsoever. But again, I don't know whether those are necessarily anger inducing, but they are small little frustrations. And of course, all these things can accumulate to generally make you feeling a bit angry if you're not in the mood for it, definitely. I think that's all I can think of off the cuff. Yeah.
Essentially, the things that I think the biggest reasons that women's anger is downplayed and tried to make it not valid as much as possible is because the level, the extremity, the profoundness of misogyny and inaccessibility, they're not going away.
Mm-hmm.
They've been around forever, and they don't seem to have been solved. You'd think they would have just been solved by now, and so that's a kind of grating, wearing down anger that I don't think men experience about anything. So I have anger about lots of different kinds of things, but the bigger picture things are things that apply to the human race. So I get angry about government. I get angry about politics. I get angry about global warming. I get angry about loads of things, but none of them are personal to me in the same way that misogyny and inaccessibility are. When it comes to how women's anger is portrayed in games, what are your experiences with that angry women characters?
I think the first thing that popped into my head when I saw that question was the scenes in the most modern Tomb Raiders, particularly in the first Tomb Raider, where there's a moment about probably in the last 10% of the game where Lara just starts going off on one and she goes on a rampage and she's like, I'm coming for you, you bastards. And it's like the first time she's sworn and in the game, I think. Probably not, actually. That's probably a lie. But yeah, it's just the delivery is like, oh, she's angry now. Shit's going down. It's that kind of atmosphere to it. Like, things have become more serious because the anger levels of Lara's character have reached maximum levels. Yeah, I guess that's one of the most impactful moments in that early Tomb Raider game. And then in comparison, in the third one, the one with the big flood and what's it called? Trying to remember, cannot remember. That's terrible. But it's the one mostly in Mexico. And she's angry, but she's doing it in a whiny way, and I hate saying it, but it did grate on me at the time, and it still does, because she's just being portrayed as this woman that's like, but I want to do it this way because what I say is the most important, and I don't care about anything else, kind of thing. And it's just the evolution of the character. She just gets more and more angry. And I actually had Googled before I joined today about the difference between revenge and avenging something. And I think in the first game, that Lara is very much avenging the deaths of her friends on the island. And in the third game, I guess it's more of a revenge, which is harsher and less concerned with justice than with retaliating and inflicting harm. So I had looked up a definition. So basically, yeah, I guess Laura thinks she's doing it for justice, but actually she's causing more harm than good, I think, by the time she gets through to the third game, which is an interesting evolution. But and how that's reflected in how I view the character is interesting as well. But yeah, other examples, the obvious ones are the main characters in The Last of Us 2 particularly, but I'm sure you guys can talk a bit more about that since you've actually played it and I have not. But yeah, it was difficult to think of. I don't think Aloy from the Horizon series is necessarily overly angry. She's quite straightforward in the way she goes about like navigating the world. She does what she needs to get the job done, and she's not. I think she's. Yeah, it's difficult to say that she's necessarily angry. I wouldn't say that she was, but definitely those two examples of Lara were the ones that first popped into my head.
I agree.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jem.
I think that's really interesting what you were saying. Sorry, go on.
So I was just going to say, as we're only like 30% through the question, so we just do this entire session on anger because it's, and we'll do violence another time because this is far more rich than clearly than I anticipated. So go ahead, Jem.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Matt. Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about the distinction between revenge and avenging, and avenging. I think that's really interesting, and I think there is that thing. I was thinking about it. One thing that, because it's not really how I relate to anger. I didn't sort of talk about it in the first question, but one thing I think is important to say is that there is this kind of idea that women shouldn't express anger, as you were saying, Matt, and I know that like there were times in my teenage years where I was particularly angry at home, and I'd be sort of screaming and shouting, and my dad would say, "Oh, you sound like a washerwoman," which is such an offensive sexist term. Bless him. But he, that did stick in me, that there's this idea that anger is a sort of is the sort of thing that women, a certain type of woman does, and and you don't want to be that type of woman, I think was what it was always about. It was sort of associated with ill-educated commoners or something. I don't know. I mean, we don't have washerwomen anymore, so it's a ridiculous term. But so I think that when I was thinking about this in relation to gaming, even though I think actually in the wider world we have a more positive reaction to anger and women being angry and all of those things, I do think that there is still a slightly patriarchal approach to women being angry in games, and so they're usually given really good reasons for being angry. So like, you can be an angry woman if your baby has been stolen or died, or you can be a really angry woman if you are avenging the unfair deaths of friends or family. But you can't just be an angry woman because it's not fair, or because you just actually like to be angry, and you have to almost justify the anger has to be justified in a way that I don't think that male characters have to have their anger justified. I think male characters there's an assumption that men can just be angry. Men are sort of born naturally angry. It's their natural state, and it's where they will return to given half a chance. Whereas for a woman to be angry, something really bad has to have happened. So I think that when game designers are working within that very narrow concept, I think it's quite challenging for them to come up with stories that fit that anger, find excuses and reasons for that anger, justify that behavior. I think there's also a lot to be said about like the way that the anger is expressed. I mean, you know, you mentioned earlier about violence, and you know, that's obviously one way that anger can be expressed, but there are other ways, revenge being one of them, avenging being another, sort of taking, you know, being like calmly calculating, you know, there's all these things, but what people really don't like is they do not like a screamy, shouty, ugly, crying woman. You know, nobody wants that angry woman anywhere near them, and it just freaks them out. And I think, you know, so there's a real challenge there, I think, with that, and how to, you know, how do we let women, you know, scream like a banshee, be angry, sound like a washerwoman, and still be perfectly entitled to their anger, and to own their anger, and to revel in it. And I don't think that, I cannot think. I mean, I think Ellie is probably the closest that we get to a woman being allowed to be angry. But even then, she's avenging stuff, isn't she? I mean, there's still that going on. There's sort of a justification for her anger. So yeah. And I think there is another thing that I would say about Ellie's anger, but I think it will count as a spoiler, so I'm not going to do that. But yeah, I just think, you know, that it's not often that we see that sort of dynamic